It's really an honor for me to be speaking with you today. I do have a varied past, and part of that includes getting a PhD at the University of Minnesota in 1990. And then since I joined the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, I've had occasion to speak at the university, usually once a year, sometimes twice a year. This year I've already spoken at a class on globalization and climate change. Usually I'm over on the West Bank speaking at Hubert Humphrey, so this is a particular pleasure to be over here. One thing I should say, maybe to connect this this unusual past that I've had, is that in the spring of 2008, I was quite content to be working on environmental and food safety regulatory affairs. And then my brother-in-law, who farms near Cedar Rapids, was asking me, so what the hell's going on in the grain elevators? They won't forward contract with me anymore, and the rural banks won't loan money to the elevators. So they're not able to spread their risks in the commodity futures market. And after hearing this and then finding out that Representative Collin Peterson was holding emergency hearings in the House Agriculture Committee to find out what was going on in the commodity markets, I was tasked to start investigating this issue. And as I began to investigate, I found that the usual explanations of agricultural economics about supply and demand were not nearly sufficient to explain the extent of volatility in commodity markets, and particularly in agriculture markets. And so over the past 3 years, I've come to know some very interesting coalition of kind of rebellious hedge fund traders who are very unhappy with the market, commodity traders, oil traders, and these people gradually coalesced into something called the Commodity Markets Oversight Coalition. And this small coalition, that is small relative to the forces on Wall Street who are opposing any financial reform, basically gave enough input into the what became the Dodd Frank legislation, so that we have part of a chapter of Dodd Frank which authorizes the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to begin to regulate commodity markets that hadn't been regulated in 15 years. So I'm going to kind of give you an overview here about what I'm going to do during the next 40 minutes or so, and you should stop me along the way. I really tried to sort of reduce the amount of terminology when you go to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission website. The glossary runs to over 150 pages of different technical terms that they use, and some of these are really kind of street terms that the traders use, but that becomes the way that they express and communicate. And then added to that, because some of the so-called complex products are mixtures of commodity and financial instruments, then you have the Securities and Exchange Commission instruments. So to kind of respond to the title of this presentation, first I want to explain what the term financialization of the commodity markets means, and then to explain the difference between excessive speculation, which is a legal term in the Commodity Exchange Act, has a very specific legal meaning, and adequate speculation, which is a term that commodity economists use when the amount of speculation, in addition to what is bet by the commodity traders themselves, is adequate to allow trades to be executed and to be cleared, that is, to be managed correctly with credit, so that adequate credit, so that you don't have defaults in the trades. Then I want to talk a little bit about food prices, and specifically the notion about how are commodity prices formed in commodity futures exchanges versus the issue of price transmission from that initial price to the retail food market. Most of my talk is going to be about price formation because there are so many steps from the time that you have a futures price settled in the exchanges to the time that that price gets transmitted to a retail food price well, we would run a course on this issue rather than a lecture. Then I'm going to talk about Dodd Frank, just a few of the many issues in this 2,500-page bill. The derivatives chapter, Chapter 7, is about 700 pages. About half of that pertains to commodities. Dodd Frank authorizes the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to write about 30 major rules and 50 minor ones. I think the average time that a U.S. federal rule takes to get through the process now is about 6 years, 7 years. But because of the extreme volatility of markets during the fast years in the last decade of deregulation, the CFTC has been working day and night to move these regulations, and at this point I think they've approved about 10 of the major regulations and about 20 of the so-called minor ones. I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about a major fight concerning position limit formulas, which is a regulatory tool to try to prevent concentration of positions that effectively allow legal market manipulation. I want to talk about the strategy of the CFTC because they're facing a massive, massive lawsuit that is financed by a couple $100 million, at least a couple $100 million, perhaps as much as $350 million of Wall Street money, which they got courtesy of us, the taxpayers, in the fall of 2008. And then I want to kind of widen out the discussion to talk about the group of 20 recommendations for commodity price volatility, because part of the complaint, especially from the Republicans, but also from Wall Street, is that, well, no matter what we do, the Europeans won't do anything, and since the United States and European markets account for about 90 to 95% of all derivatives trade, that means that they could take advantage of our markets and sink Wall Street. The City of London would live forever, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of, it's really sort of bizarre. I mean, most of these banks, as you'll see, are transnational. They don't obey, national policy priorities, except for very opportunistic reasons. And then I want to talk a little bit about the challenges of harmonizing the U.S. and the European Union's regulatory cooperation and harmonization program, and then finally take a look at what the outlook is for commodity market reform. I want to start with a few basic terms because I don't want to assume that everybody here reads the back pages of the Financial Times, where you find these terms discussed on a daily basis. Most farmers don't play the commodity futures and options market. The only one that I knew when I was growing up was my Aunt Catherine, who made a fortune, actually. And she would be there in the morning with what I found out later was the Financial Times, because it was the only orange paper I'd ever seen in my life, newspaper, looking at very tiny print. And that is the place where farmer cooperatives, where companies like General Mills, companies that process or transport or trade agricultural and other commodities go to spread their price risks, preventing them from being caught with a sudden price rise, or in the case of farm cooperatives trying to prevent sudden price collapses so that the value of their members' contracts decreases suddenly. So in forward contracting, basically let's say it's my brother-in-law Ray says, I'm going to deliver to you, let's let's say, 2,000 bushels of number 2 yellow corn on this date. And then the elevator, which knows that Ray's a good customer, says, okay, I'm going to forward you this amount of money so that you can plant and buy inputs and have some cash flow to manage your farm. In the event that you have a bad harvest, generally speaking, farmers can manage those risks in one of two ways. Either they sell the product that is in their bins on farm, so grains or oil seeds, or, and usually this is their first option, they will cash in their crop insurance and use that to pay the elevator. That works provided that the futures and options market works to hedge commercial risk for what are called bona fide hedgers. That is, companies that, or investors that use the futures and options market to hedge commercial risks. And basically, agricultural contracts have a duration of 90 days. You are going to buy a contract of X quantity in Y quality to be delivered to point Z on such and such a date. And either you take delivery of that contract or you roll it over by getting somebody else to buy the contract. And that rollover is typically what happens for traditional speculators. Traditional speculators are those who provide the necessary liquidity beyond what is provided by those who are actually hedging the commodities. Now, beginning in the early 1990s, actually in 1991, you have the rise of something called an index speculator. And index speculators, unlike traditional speculators, do not bet on the basis of supply and demand and other fundamental factors that can include logistical issues or regulatory decisions. Instead, the index speculator always bets long. That it means bets to increase the price because the investor for these for this particular instrument is a pension fund or a university endowment that has a very long horizon. So your commodity speculator, traditional speculator or commercial hedger, has a horizon of 90 days, 6 months at the very outside a year in the case of some metals contracts. But index speculators just have a portfolio design, and the portfolio design is mixed with bonds and equity issues and interest rate contracts, and oh, by the way, let's throw in some corn and wheat and oil and maybe some gold. And I'll explain to you a little bit more about how that index speculation works. In theory, the price discovery process should be fairly straightforward. I offer something, you bid something, and going through an exchange that acts as the buyer for every seller and the seller for every buyer, we settle on a price. So that's the classic kind of economics book model, and these prices are then reported on a daily basis to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And at the end of each week, the CFTC issues a commitment of traders report, which classically is supposed to represent the positions of small and large traders. However, in a situation of excessive speculation, when you don't know what's going on with your market, positions are exceeding those that are defined in the Commodity Exchange Act. You begin to have price distortion. Instead of having your futures price come close to your cash price at the end of the contract, you have a diversion of these prices, which makes it impossible for buyers, for example, at Delta. Richard Anderson, the CEO of Delta, is a member of the commodity market, well, the firm is a member of the Commodity Markets Oversight Coalition, extremely angry that their fuel buyers cannot hedge prices because of the volatility in the oil markets. Would anybody like to take a guess as to who is the largest owner of oil in the eastern United States? Goldman Sachs owns more oil than anybody else. They own physical oil. So they have huge oil contracts. They can work the market on both ends, both the spot market, the physical market, and the futures market. The traditional means to try to control the domination of the commodity market by financial players is something called position limits. Basically, it limits you to a certain percentage of contracts, and the CFTC, classically, is supposed to take a look at what the position limit rule is. They sit down every Friday afternoon and they say, oh, Morgan Stanley is over the limit, let's write them. They probably don't know what they're doing. Let's write them a letter, and they will liquidate the position, and we won't have the danger of excessive speculation. During the Bush administration, they exempted all energy trades from reporting. So the regulators had no idea what was going on in the energy markets. There were no limits on metals. And furthermore, on the agricultural contracts for which there were positional limits, the CFTC wrote what are called no action letters, saying, well, you've exceeded the position limit, but it's okay, we're not going to take any regulatory action. They wrote at least 700 of them. The CFTC is still trying to figure out what the Bush administration was doing during the previous 8 years.
I got to wrap my mind around this long trade issue. I don't get that part. Can you just explain that? Like, they're betting on prices rising, you said?
Right. Right. So traditionally, you have either betting long or betting short. And so, if you are General Mills, for example, and you think that prices for wheat are out of control, you're going to bet short as a traditional speculator. You're going to bet short in addition to what you bet in actual contracts where you would take delivery of wheat. Okay? If you're an index speculator and your investment charter says we are going to increase commodity prices by X percentage in this index, you're going to bet only to increase regardless of the fundamentals. You don't care because your fund has so much weighted money, so much more money in the market than any commercial hedger or group of commercial hedgers can afford to invest, that you can be confident that the prices are going to go up, which indeed, for the most part they have. Until there's some, really underlying catastrophe, total crop failure, major oil spill, something like that, which really disturbs the underlying asset on top of which the derivatives are built. This is sort of the global look on food prices, sort of a historical look, using 2002 to 2004 as a benchmark. Right? So here we have prices in 1990. Things are relatively stable until we go here, right? Beginning in 2007, climbing, collapsing, and now again climbing past the bubble of 2008. Basically, we have nominal value of prices, and here the yellow line is for inflation-deflated prices according to a World Bank index. Okay, so that just gives you a really broad picture. Now, FAO, these are usually sort of the headline numbers, but what's really interesting is to look at their food price index reports, where you can find out, so what's the price of millet in Chad? They do get reporting. It's a little slow, but it's well worth looking at if you're interested in the food prices, not at the retail level, at the wholesale level, generally speaking at the wholesale level, in developing countries. Because a lot of the price distortion in developing country markets doesn't occur simply in response to what happens at the Chicago Board of Trade, but is a result of what happens with local importers, because you could have your chief importer be the brother of the president, right? And basically operate with impunity. Now let's talk a little bit about Dodd Frank and what was supposed to have been done to prevent excessive speculation. So after a furious debate, there, if you go to the CFTC website, which is really a model of transparency, you can find out who met with whom when and what documents they left and so on and so forth. The new chair of the CFTC is a former Goldman Sachs trader named Gary Gensler. Really a model civil servant. This guy has walked into more lions' dens than I can count. But he was stuck facing a $330 million lobbying campaign against the implementation of the Dodd Frank derivatives legislation. And basically, the Wall Street tactic was, we are going to take this to the Supreme Court as a violation of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And we're going to win, because we have friends on the court. So the CFTC strategy, and so IATP came out with a press release. I mean, it had to be said that the limits that were set were far too high to prevent excessive speculation. I mean, we're sort of obliged to say that. But what I probably should have added was that the CFTC was obliged to set these bad limits because they needed a legal strategy to apply to defend their right to rulemaking in the Supreme Court. And so what they did was to take what are called legacy position limits on 9 agricultural contracts that have never been challenged in court. So these have been around since the 1930s, 1934, 35. The Chamber of Commerce has never challenged them. The International Swaps and Derivatives Association has never challenged them. Chicago Mercantile Exchange has never challenged them. Nobody's ever challenged those limits. And basically, the CFTC is daring the Supreme Court to overthrow more than 75 years of precedent in position limits. It's, with this Supreme Court, it's kind of a hard bet. There is no such thing as judicial modesty. I think that's what John Roberts promised when he interviewed for his job.
Could you give us an idea of what the limits, the rule limits are, or the legacy limits, and what they should be?
Well, so there's different limits for, depending on whether you have what are called spot month contracts, where you would be taking physical delivery of a product, or whether you would have cash-only contracts, which are designed so that you never take delivery. And traditional speculators would use those. So the idea is that you shouldn't have a market in which a few players can control the market. Unfortunately, the spot position limit is 25% of total deliverable supply, which means in theory that 4 players could control the market. Commercial hedgers never have that much money, so for them, if it's not an issue. But if Wall Street gets the exemptions that it wants, they could, in theory, they and a couple of other investment banks could control the market and do so legally. One of the things that we had asked for, that is the Commodity Markets Oversight Coalition, is that there should be an annual review of position limits to adjust. And I wrote a comment that said, in the area of climate change, you're going to have some kind of emergency review system, because it's going to become more difficult to predict what supply management is. Another thing that was very important to the rule that we had proposed is something called aggregate position limits, so that if you have a trading entity that has positions in different markets, right, and these markets, some of these markets are outside the United States, that you would have to aggregate those positions, and they could not exceed the limit. Explaining how these are calculated, I have to say, is a little complicated and really above my knowledge. But the oil traders, the metals traders, the ag traders were all unhappy within our coalition. But They sort of sucked it up, and I think in the interest of supporting the CFTC just said, you know, this is a good first step. I mean, you know, it's not a good first step, but it was the only step that the CFTC could take, given, you know, what is certainly going to be a really nasty and probably expedited Supreme Court decision. One of the things that Wall Street has sought is an exemption for position limits for something that are called swaps that it does with end users. A swap is essentially an exchange of the cash flow of either options contracts or futures contracts. Some of these instruments intuitively don't make a lot of sense to me, but let's say that you had an interest rate contract and the interest rates were very volatile and you wanted to somehow hedge against it with a commodity that you understood, like oil. You could construct a derivative called a mixed swap that would have both a financial and commodity element. More typically, a swap concerns you know, like contracts, so interest rates or maybe bonds. And all of these actually affect commodities because commodity contracts, you know, are even though they're done dominantly in dollars, you do have other currencies that are in which commodity contracts are dominated, and commodity contracts also need to carry interest, for example, on storage. So these interest rates, interest rate contracts, exchange rate contracts do affect commodity prices. What Wall Street, what the banks are arguing is, well, we're part of this, we're part of these deals, so we should be getting the same exemptions as the commercial hedgers get. And the International Swaps and Derivatives Association proposed that, that we should define commercial risk not as the risk on wheat or the risk on oil, but the risk on all our financial contracts. So, for example, this would make the trades that MF Global did completely legal. So with MF Global, you've got them taking farmer cooperative money, $600 million of which has disappeared, and using it to invest in European bond markets. Okay? And you could say, well, I'm doing a swap between commodities and European bonds. And so I should have the same protections, the same exemptions that are offered to commercial hedgers. You know, you can have futures contracts in all manner of commodities. You can have futures contracts in interest rates and bond rates. Then you have the options contracts, which have less collateral costs, fewer obligations, and they're used more by traditional speculators. That's where you get your residual liquidity. And then you have the over-the-counter contracts, the over-the-counter derivatives, which are, you know, 7 times as large as their regulated market. That's what you want to purge. And what's really nasty about a lot of these derivatives is that they're traded in high-frequency trading algorithms that don't respond to anything except the algorithm formula. And they're traded through something called the Bloomberg Market Master. And you're talking about milliseconds difference in trades, and they have these things where they try to co-locate mega banks of servers, you know, in New Jersey and move their trading floors as close as they can to these servers. It's absolutely lunatic that these trading patterns should be allowed to inject volatility in the market when there's absolutely no fundamental reason for it. And 90% of that of high-frequency trading is called spoofing, where you place an order without completing it in order to basically spoof your rivals. And for reasons beyond understanding, this is still legal. One of the things that's really strange is that despite their name, right, commodity exchanges, exchanges trade over-the-counter contracts in their off hours. And so you've got this explosion of over-the-counter trading in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, in the Intercontinental Exchange, which is completely unregulated. In the Bush administration parlance, it's called an exempt market. So they don't report any trades, except as they wish to. So the theory of a buyer for every seller and a seller for every buyer works in a regulated market. But when only a seventh or less of the market is regulated, it doesn't work because you don't know who your counterparty is, especially when the contract has been traded so often. This is what happened in September of 2008. You had this massive credit freeze because the counterparties didn't trust each other, because they didn't know how many times the derivatives contract had been resold and to whom. And this was one of the things that, unhappily, Minnesota farm co-ops found out, that they thought that they had been investing in traditional futures contracts, and instead their money had been taken and been put into bond derivatives in Europe, and nothing to prevent them from doing so. The International Organization of Securities Commissions has a commodity market authority, and insofar as there's not really any international regulation of commodity markets, but these are basically a place where regulators meet to try to decide what to do about commodity markets. And whereas during the last decade they were extremely subservient, this particular document, showed a bit of spine, and I was pleasantly surprised, and it gives me a little hope. I wrote a comment to them, and to my great surprise, they actually took it. Finally, one of the things that's really nasty, and I'm going to come up here, is that you have something called exchange-traded funds. These used to be things like mutual funds. You knew what was in them. You owned a little piece of this company and that company, and so on and so forth. Now everything has been run through the derivatives mill, and they have things called synthetic exchange-traded funds, which, despite their name, are traded dark on over-the-counter deals. And the Financial Stability Board said this is a very disquieting development, which, if you were an NGO, you'd be screaming in alarm. But of course, these guys are bankers or bank regulators, and so they don't get excited so easily as I do. So challenges for the US-EU cooperation. This is absolutely crucial that they manage to harmonize the rules to some extent, because the US and the EU have to write a memorandum, or they have to revise a memorandum of understanding in order to comply with Section 722 of Dodd Frank, which calls for a comparable regulatory regime if you want to access US markets for a company that's traded on a foreign board of trade. Now, the problem here is that the European Union has no commodity regulatory authority. And the largest commodity markets in Europe, those in London, like it like that. Because one of our hedge fund traders said, my God, the entire city of London is one gigantic loophole. In the CFTC, you have, the connoisseurs have loopholes they name for their patrons. So, for example, the Enron loophole, or the Dubai loophole. But here, just said, the entire thing is one gigantic loophole. So you've got no commodity regulatory authority. France has proposed one. Britain has rejected it. And so instead what you have is this little agency called the European Securities Market Authority, which has a staff of 55 people. The Commodities Futures Trading Commission has over 800. The Securities Exchange Commission has over 3,000. But the role of the European Securities Market Authority is to try to coordinate the regulation of not just commodities, but interest rates, equities, bonds, every asset that's traded in the member state, in the 27 member states of the European Union. So huge problem there that has to be worked out somehow during the next couple of years. Regulatory cooperation right now just focuses on the global banks, the so-called too-big-to-fail banks, rather than on commercial hedgers. The CFTC and both the European Commission are really going to have to add commercial hedgers so their voice can be heard, because they are getting hammered. Finally, a huge source of opposition here, and something I find really strange, is that people keep talking about nationalism in banks. But here we see a July 21st report from the General Accountability Office, in which, thanks to Senator Bernie Sanders, the Federal Reserve for the first time was forced to divulge its emergency loan programs. And what you see here is that the bank, between December 2007 and July of 2010, provided $16.1 trillion in emergency loans to U.S. and EU banks, right? So we got Citigroup, Morgan Stanley there at the head, and so on and so forth down the line, right? These are all billions, okay? Billions in Federal Reserve money, which is at the lowest federal rate, as if these were deposit-taking institutions, because they were reclassified such at the insistence of Secretary Paulson. So your biggest gamblers are getting the cheapest rates. Any chimp can then take that money and go back and buy treasury bonds or European bank central bonds and make 3% or 2.5%. It does not take a genius to take money that is offered so cheaply, really practically given away. But obviously the full faith and credit of the United States is put into play when you're loaning out that money. And certainly right now, given the amount of exposure that U.S. banks have to European markets, there's another emergency loan program, maybe not quite that size, but definitely something going on. I wanted to put this in because it's so astonishing to me, I can't even tell you how to describe it. So in July 2010, the U.S. Reserve Federal Bank of New York asked their staff to try to describe the shadow banking system. And this is it. Now, I couldn't even read the type. I just thought that, well, okay, so like this is the whole thing, I guess, so far as they could chart it. And to me, it just signals kind of the enormity of the task that the regulators have before them when you have a whole kind of parallel banking system that's trading dark and about which the regulators have very little trade data relative to what they have for the regulated industry. International Finance in Washington is the biggest lobbyist shop for the banks. They deny that financial investment had anything to do with commodity market speculation, and that theoretically it could ever have anything to do with commodity market speculation. So we wrote a letter to them, attaching a bibliography around 80 academic studies that said otherwise. The International Swaps and Derivatives Association designs the contracts according to which derivatives and swaps using futures and options contracts as their building blocks are organized. And Jill Summers, chief lobbyist for the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, is now one of the 5 members of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. She is a Republican commissioner. As I said, the commodity futures exchanges are opposing Dodd Frank. The Chamber of Commerce Capital Markets Committee, this is just part of their overall jihad against regulation. And then you have U.S. and House Senate Republicans, some of whom I think are ideologically opposed, but a lot of whom have just been taking cash for so long that they don't know what else to do. But you really don't see, what you see among the House Republican bills is basically a requirement that every rule be subject to an a priori cost-benefit analysis, which has never been done in the history of U.S. regulation. And then you have, in opposition to some House and Senate Democrats whose districts benefit supposedly from excessive speculation. So Senator Charles Schumer of New York being the most important member of the Democratic opposition. Then finally we get to talk about people that I would say are in favor of fair, orderly, and transparent markets. I mentioned the CFTC, the staff has really done heroic work. I don't know when they get to sleep, but I guess they do sometimes. Talk a little bit about the Commodity Markets Oversight Coalition. I haven't talked about the Americans for Financial Reform, which they have a broad array of issues they work on. But I've worked with some of their lobbyists on derivatives, and these are really, really first-rate lobbyists for the public interest. Somebody that has to be praised here, because I don't think he can be praised enough, is Representative Collin Peterson. Dodd Frank really should be called the Peterson Dodd Frank bill. He provided the intellectual architecture for it. He stood up to a lot of people in now being in the minority. He still makes blistering speeches about what is going to happen if these markets aren't regulated. And I'm kind of impressed that he does that, since he needs Republican votes for the farm bill that he wants to protect production agriculture. A really heroic group, in my view, a bunch of, well, the head of the commodity derivatives analysis unit at Better Markets, a Washington NGO, is a former Goldman trader who got sick of it all. But they also do analysis of the SEC and the Federal Reserve Bank rules, and do a really tremendous job. Michael Greenberger used to be the assistant to Brooksley Born, the CFTC commissioner, who told Secretary Robert Rubin and Alan Greenspan that what they were doing was going to destroy the economy. She was right. They were wrong. She got booted out of government, and I hope is kind of preparing to be a witness in this nasty lawsuit that's going to be coming up. And then I think not enough can be said for the UN Conference on Trade and Develop's Globalization Unit. They've done heroic work in the face of US and European opposition, because as a UN agency, they have to find their budget where they can. And then there are two really great European NGOs who really help all of us track what's going on in the very complicated European Commission process. So, thank you very much. A few critical resources. And take you have, first, an excessive import dependence, right? As a result of free trade agreements, countries that used to be nearly self-sufficient in basic grains are now 80% dependent on imports, over which they have absolutely no control of price, and that are, largely denominated in dollars, some in euros, some in yen. So, from the viewpoint of import dependence, commodity futures prices have a big impact, because the freight on board prices that they ship to these countries are used futures prices as benchmarks. So there's that. Now, with the World Bank, after 25 years of saying, well, agriculture, we shouldn't invest in it because it's not very profitable, has suddenly found religion. It's the wrong kind of religion, because they now want these countries to buy U.S. technology and inputs and so on and so forth. But at least they're no longer saying, oh, Haiti, it's not important that you grow rice, right? It's really hard to change patterns, and loss of knowledge especially. I mean, there's been a terrible loss of traditional knowledge about agriculture as a result of the disinvestment of agriculture. And so, that investment is being reinflated. Unfortunately, most investment runs through the World Bank Group and not through Food and Agriculture Organization, which has a lot more knowledge. The Deputy Director of Knowledge, and I'm not kidding, that's an actual position, is a former U.S. Trade Representative official. She's there, as they say in UN Parliament, or in U.S. State Department parlance, to babysit the FEO officials so they don't have the wrong kind of knowledge. Ann Tutwiler, that's her name. So it's a fight. It's going to be a real fight to reduce import dependency, especially for the low-income countries, because they simply have been, their treasuries have been savaged, and they should be reserving those treasuries for essential imports that they cannot produce, instead of for food that they obviously can. The Obama administration, unfortunately, this is again a very personal view. I think with the bad appointments, the Senate confirmable appointments were basically the result of a president who thought, I can only have so many confirmable fights, Senate confirmable fights. And I think even now there's like 1,000 positions of high-level executives that are not filled because of the indiscriminate use of the filibuster. Now, what really does tick me off, though, is that the non-confirmable positions, like the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, I mean, why on earth would you, promote a proven failure like Larry Summers to that job? I mean, there are some retreads that, I mean, there are plenty of people they could have appointed. They could have appointed Mohammed El Idrian, who's the they have the most successful bond fund in the world.
Is it a lack of comprehension?
I think part of it, quite frankly, I mean, this is going to sound really biased, but I think there's a terrible best and the brightest Harvard, Chicago University complex. I think there's a real terrible inability to deal with anything which is not a pedigree degree. So if you're coming out with what is regarded as heterodoxy, and well, even if you had a Harvard degree, you wouldn't be taken on board. But there's a real, I mean, we've got some people who really prove that you rise to the level of your incompetence. Right? I mean, Summers lost $6 billion, of the Harvard endowment as an advisor for D.L. Shaw. How does that not qualify you for, a position teaching in, a junior college in Alaska? I mean, why is this man being promoted? Right? I mean, that's, I simply do not understand that. On the other hand, I'm not, in White House culture. The Obama administration, unfortunately, this is again a very personal view. I think, with the bad appointments, the Senate confirmable appointments were basically the result of, a president who thought I can only have so many, confirmable fights, Senate confirmable fights. And I think even now there's like 1,000 positions of high-level executives that are not filled because of the indiscriminate use of the filibuster. Now, what really does tick me off, though, is that the non-confirmable positions, like the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, I mean, why on earth would you, promote a proven failure like Larry Summers to that job? I mean, there are some retreads that, I mean, there are plenty of people they could have appointed. They could have appointed Mohammed El-Idrian, who's the, the head of the most successful bond fund in the world.
Is it a lack of comprehension? I think
part of it, quite frankly, I mean, this is going to sound really biased, but I think there's a terrible best and the brightest Harvard, Chicago University complex. I think there's a real terrible inability to deal with anything which is not a pedigree degree. So if you're coming out with what is regarded as heterodoxy, and well, even if you had a Harvard degree, you wouldn't be taken on board. But there's a real, I mean, we've got some people who really prove that, you rise to the level of your incompetence. Right? I mean, Summers lost $6 billion, of the Harvard endowment as an advisor for D.L. Shaw. How does that not qualify you for, a position teaching in, a junior college in Alaska? I mean, why is this man being promoted? Right? I mean, that's, I simply do not understand that. On the other hand, I'm not, in White House culture, so I really don't appreciate those kind of things. Yeah.
So you had stated that the position limits passed are basically ineffective. Do you see any other price regulating mechanisms, such as food reserves or something like that, having any effect on these types of markets?
I don't think that reserves can work as a price moderating tool until you have regulation of the futures market. I think that if these legacy limits survive Supreme Court challenge, that their ineffectiveness will become evident very soon, and that there will be, new limits set within a year that will be more effective. I mean, this is a trial and error thing, and it's gonna change according to deliverable supply, and then they've got to get a handle on high frequency trading. I mean, it provides no useful liquidity. It violates the Commodity Exchange Act because it's not putting in price information, which actually results in price formation that is a benefit to commercial hedgers. I mean, it violates the most basic tenets of the law. And I don't know, Security Exchange Act. The only instrument in which high frequency trading may have a role, and I defer to people who really know this, might be interest rates, just because of the volume of interest rate trading, but no other asset requires it. None. And spoofing has to be outlawed. That's just outrageous.
Okay, anybody else who has a question is welcome to ask Steve, but I think we should kind of wind up the formal part of this, and I'm so excited that there's this much interest in this talk, and it's nice to see new faces here.
Okay, can I say one last thing? Is that, you know, one of the reasons that I that I'm no longer doing as much, you know, food safety regulatory work as I did before is that foundations lost huge amounts of money to Wall Street. Ford Foundation lost a third of its endowment, and as a result, foundations have become much more conservative and limited the kind of programs they do. And a lot of the officers lost their jobs.
Okay, well, thank you so much.